March 2019 was the moment Disney officially acquired most of 21st Century Fox, including the rights to Alien. And as the 40th anniversary of the original, it was a great time to revitalize. Many events were already unfolding, from a collection of fan films released on IGN. It saw the release of William Gibson's Alien 3 in audio play form, with Michael Biehn and Lance Henriksen reprising their roles. An official short film involving David's experiments following on from Covenant. A novelization of the acclaimed Alien Isolation game. And Dark Horse Comics' final Aliens comic miniseries, Rescue. Remember, their books were all Aliens, not Alien, because of the adaptation of the 1986 film, not the original. But they did, however, create one final Aliens-related miniseries the following year titled Alien, the Original Screenplay. Dan O'Bannon had passed away during the film's 30th anniversary, but his pre-Brandywine script was turned into a 5-issue comic book story, a whole different kind of alien getting a brief moment in the sun as the torch was passed. Disney, as established, had already purchased Marvel Comics for the IP and the successful Marvel Studios, but as they had a comic book company, it made sense for them to produce comic books inside of the Disney Empire, starting in 2020, along with the collected works of Dark Horse's run of the franchise. Interestingly, despite having gone up against Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, Judge Dredd, Jim Lee's Wildcats, Vampirella, and inexplicably Buffy the Vampire Slayer, though the title of weirdest crossover would have to go to Archie vs. Predator. But still, it wasn't until now that Marvel icons would have the chance to meet up with the aliens.
A series of alternate covers to regular issues celebrated this at the start of 2021. A similar Predator celebration was delayed due to rights disputes over the Predator IP.
Unlike Dark Horse, Marvel's series of comics were titled Alien, not Aliens, with two exceptions because they were both tied to the 1986 sequel. One of them, Aftermath, is a story of an investigation into what happened on Hadley's Hope on Acheron. The other is one of Marvel's seminal what-if stories, but not one you'd likely ever have guessed. What if Carter Burke had survived? Written by the actor Paul Reiser and his son, though sadly no watcher was involved. But the Disney Empire had more than that, and it was also in 2020 that they announced that FX would be creating a television series based upon the Alien property titled Alien Earth, though it would take almost 5 years before its release in the summer of 2025. Ridley Scott served as executive producer. His third prequel film may have fallen through, but he was still interested in shepherding the series that he believed he had revitalized. But of course, one thing was glaringly missing for this film franchise: a film. Uruguayan filmmaker Fede Alvarez had made a mark with his Evil Dead remake in 2013 and Don't Breathe in 2016, both impressive horror hits, and as you can imagine given that, he was a fan of Alien. While talking to Ridley Scott, he gave a casual pitch for his idea for an Alien sequel that avoided the questions of Alien 3 and Resurrection entirely, and of treading in Scott's prequel territory either. It was just a direct sequel to the original, but tangential to that storyline. Scott really didn't think much on it in the moment, but it did stick with him as something different than what others had been trying. The year after Alien Earth was announced, he called up Alvarez out of the blue and asked if he was still interested in making his Alien movie. Alvarez had had a rough period, having one film bomb and the Don't Breathe sequel do less than hoped. But 2021 was when Alvarez's Apple Plus series Calls was released to universal acclaim. Good news when a company is looking to restart a tentpole franchise. Alvarez was very enthusiastic about the idea, and Scott came aboard as producer of the first Alien-specific film in a quarter century. No crossover, no background figure. This time the xenomorph was again the star of the show. Alvarez's pitch had outlined a fresh scenario, a band of younger characters in a remote, hostile environment. Not surprising, given Evil Dead and Don't Breathe, that his idea of Alien was focused on a similar band of endangered characters. Far from the various professionals we've seen over the other works, from space truckers to space marines, from scientists to mercenaries, the alien hadn't actually menaced the traditional horror film victim before. The screenplay, co-written with his frequent collaborator Rodo Sajigaze, centered on 6 space colonist scavengers who stumble upon an abandoned research station. The film would lean into the horror roots of the franchise with characters largely unarmed and clearly outmatched, evoking the vulnerability and suspense of the 1979 original. It wasn't to be about action, but the horror of being trapped with an implacable hunter. The rewrites and revisions focused more on integrating franchise lore rather than altering this fundamental plot. When the project was announced, it was made clear that this film would not exist in a vacuum. A response to early trade reports that labeled the film a standalone, unconnected story was potentially harmful, so Alvarez assured the public that every draft kept the Alien continuity in mind. While the usual themes of the series was present, human greed, tampering with nature, dehumanization, the new key theme that quickly emerged was family. The 6 were paired off as 3 pairs of siblings, 1 pair biologically, 1 pair by adoption, and 1 human and 1 android. While Aliens had explored a maternal bond before, this kind of familial bond would provide a new dynamic to it, while avoiding the typical pairs of lovers plus the virgin that was more common. The decision was even made to have the station be 2 halves and named after the famous siblings of myth, Romulus and Remus, eventually serving as the foundation of the film's title. In the case of the protagonist, Rain, her brother was a rebuilt Weyland-Yutani mining android named Andy, a relationship that would consequently be tested and complicated as they venture onto the Weyland-Yutani station. But Andy wasn't the only android that would make an appearance. In 2016, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, brought back Grand Moff Tarkin on board the Death Star. Rather than appearing via elaborate makeup as had been done in Revenge of the Sith, they used a CGI recreation of Peter Cushing, thanks to a fortunate, or unfortunate depending on your point of view, bit part that he had played in Top Secret. In order to pull that gag off, it required makeup, which required a cast of Peter Cushing's face. And, as is often the case, that old piece was still around. So Disney purchased it, then scanned it into a computer. The result? A fully digital Grand Moff Tarkin. Disney got permission from the Cushing estate for the use of his likeness, and compensated them for it. The result wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. But it did kick off a discussion about likeness rights and technology. It should be noted that this is nothing new. One of the earliest and most infamous examples of this was in 1997, involving the late Fred Astaire, who'd passed away 10 years earlier.
The powerful Dirt Devil Ultra Swivel Glide has swivel casters for effortless maneuverability at every turn. The amazing Ultra Swivel Glide. Nothing escapes the power of a Dirt Devil.
Naturally, the idea of using a dead man to sell your vacuum cleaners was met with controversy. At least Rogue One was an artistic work, utilizing a character that the actor chose to play, and done to create a sense of narrative and cultural continuity, and placed over an actual actor who was giving a performance. They didn't change it so the actual performer was now dancing with an appliance. Something of a middle ground was done in the decade between those two for the villain of Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow by compositing images of Sir Laurence Olivier to create the distorted villain, something that by and large went without controversy. On the other hand, DirecTV's campaign involving stand-ins for dead actors, not even CGI, caused controversy that led to pulling parts of the campaign.
They're here.
No, honey, they're not here.
We forgot to switch to DirecTV. So instead of watching our favorite channels in HD, we're stuck watching cable. Forgetting to switch to DirecTV? Yeah, that's gonna come back to haunt me.
Stand-ins for dead actors isn't unprecedented. From the infamous Plan 9 from Outer Space that used Ed Wood's girlfriend's chiropractor in place of Bela Lugosi, to the likely forgotten Wagons East, which was incomplete when John Candy died. Things were substantially different, however, when actor Paul Walker died in a car accident before the completion of the seventh The Fast and the Furious film. In that case, they used Walker's relatives as stand-ins, and Weta then altered the features to match the actor. That was completely without controversy. In fact, it was seen as a way of giving a respectful conclusion to his role. Likewise, the recreation of Harold Ramis for Ghostbusters Afterlife was universally accepted as a touching cameo that paid respect to the beloved creator. The lesson, if one can be gleaned from all of this, suggests that it ultimately comes down to keep it necessary, keep it respectful, keep it minimal, keep from shilling household appliances. Also emerging was the use of de-aging digital technology. An original use for Princess Leia in the aforementioned Rogue One was considered iffy, but Disney put it to better use with Captain America Civil War for Robert Downey Jr., and in Captain Marvel in 2019, de-aging Samuel L. Jackson and Clark Gregg for their 90s appearance. And in The Mandalorian to make a Luke Skywalker that was far closer to Return of the Jedi than Mark Hamill currently looked. De-aging is a whole different set of issues with audiences, concerned that it prevents young actors from taking roles that they normally would have gotten due to aging stars, and the question of the technology's efficacy. Tron's use of it in 2010 was met with far more enthusiasm than The Irishman in 2019. Which brings us to this new Alien film. See, Ridley Scott, producer remember, felt that it was a shame that there was only one appearance of Ian Holm in Alien, the original, while Lance Henriksen and Michael Fassbender both played more than one character in the series. Originally, Rook was to be a new female android, with nothing particularly special about her, just someone filling a role. But since the character was there solely to fulfill plot requirements and provide exposition, Scott thought the character would be enhanced if they could make this a callback to Ash. With that, the android is no longer a Weyland-Yutani avatar, but someone the audience is familiar with. Alvarez agreed it made Rook more interesting if it was of the same model as Ash. So with the permission of Ian Holm's widow and his estate, they looked to see how they might bring Ash into their new film. Legacy Effects built a detailed animatronic head and torso for Rook, in just 3 weeks in fact. Like with Peter Cushing and Top Secret, the animatronic was based upon a 20-year-old head scan made of Ian Holm, for the Lord of the Rings trilogy in this case. Puppeteers handled on-set movements for realism, showing the damage Rook had taken from the alien with exposed wiring and milky blood everywhere. Visual effects studio Metaphysics then stepped in, using machine learning to study footage of Ian Holm in Alien. They used the de-age technology to then augment the animatronic footage, trying to improve the appearance of the animatronic to more resemble a living person. Actor Daniel Betts provided facial capture and voice performance as a reference for how the face should change and the line should be delivered by Rook. The initial results were less than ideal, but when time ran out, the subpar effects had to be sent to the theaters. But Alvarez persuaded Disney to finish the effects for the later releases to give them a better look. While some are still somewhat underwhelming, many do successfully appear like Rook is lifelike, if that word applies. The incomplete look certainly didn't help the controversy of the choice. It seemed that for many, it didn't rise to the level of necessary, respectful, and minimal, though at least he wasn't used to plug the Aspen beer created as a tie-in to the film's release.
Alvarez said in one sense that he welcomed the backlash some had to Rook's appearance, saying that this is part of what the film is addressing, dehumanization by technology. In that sense, he reasoned, it's almost kind of meta. He also made the argument that dead people's likeness has been recreated countless times by makeup artists and actors. noting, for instance, that Gary Oldman's portrayal of Churchill would likely have offended the historical figure had he seen it. And that is pretending to be the individual, while Rook is a fictional character. They weren't trying to recreate the man Ian Holm, they were trying to recreate a fictional character based upon Ian Holm. I should make clear that I am only clarifying his argument, not advancing it.
Because it should be noted that audiences are split upon this point. Some don't mind it or even welcome it. Others find it ghoulish. The issue is obviously going to require resolving on what the public will accept. It's as new as the recent Stan Lee hologram, and at least as old as the case of Lugosi v. Universal Pictures. See, in 1966, Bela Lugosi's widow and his son sued for the continued profiting of his likeness in the selling of Dracula-related merchandise, a case that was finally resolved in the California Supreme Court in 1979, reversing a lower court's ruling and siding with Universal because these were personal rights of Bela Lugosi and personal rights cannot be passed down. The case thus led to, as the Supreme Court called for, legislative bodies to address the question of such rights. Likely we're witnessing a time when this entire issue will be nailed down, for actors to protect their images and companies to protect themselves from lawsuits. Because after all, for all its power, AI can recreate, but it cannot create. That's something that only flesh and blood actors can do. In casting the film, Alvarez deliberately sought fresh faces to try to recapture the ensemble feel of the original film. One he particularly had an eye on was Kaylee Spaney, who had auditioned for a different film but was too young for the role, yet she had left a strong impression. When they began developing Romulus, one of the first things Alvarez did was pin Spaney's photo to a vision board saying, "That's the face of the character," and wrote the film around her. The studio was fine with the choice. Spaney had recently had a small but acclaimed role in Mayor of Easttown, and before that a role in the FX miniseries Devs, so they were convinced she had the chops for the role. Spaney noted that the original Alien felt like a theater piece with a blue-collar vibe, and she tried to bring that to the protagonist, Rain, that she's from a long line of farmers. Very Americana, very sort of meat and potatoes, she said. For Rain's brother Andy, they went with David Johnson, who at the time was one of the main cast on the HBO-BBC series Industry. It was, of course, a lot of pressure, considering he was going to be joining a group that included Ian Holm, Michael Fassbender, and Lance Henriksen, whose characters all left a huge impression on audiences. Asking if Ridley Scott had given him any advice, Johnson said Scott told him, "Don't be shit." He said the faith they placed in him helped give him the confidence to take the character to the places that he needed to go, especially important considering he undergoes a sort of Flowers for Algernon change in the film when the simple dad joke-telling robot gets an unplanned intelligence upgrade that also leaves him much more unsettling. Johnson said that he didn't think about playing as a robot, but rather like people who struggle with speaking. Note, for instance, how Johnson doubles down on the bad joke by having Andy deliver it with no grasp of comedic timing.
Did you hear about the miner who lost his left side? He's all right now. Did you get it? He's all right.
Archie Renault, who had recently been one of the leads in Netflix's adaptation of Shadow and Bone, had auditioned for the part of Andy, but was cast as Tyler, the main human male character. Playing Tyler's cousin Bjorn was Spike Fearn, who sent in a tape doing what he himself describes as a terrible American accent, and was cast provided that he perform in his own British accent. Former child star Isabella Merced now played the adult sister of Tyler, Kay, and newcomer Aileen Wu took the sixth role of Navarro, Bjorn's adopted sister and the principal pilot of their ship. Showing the uniqueness of this franchise, Wu, the least known of the cast, was the only one featured on most of the posters, but as the victim of the iconic facehugger. While they had confidence in the young actors, Alvarez wanted to make it easier for less experienced performers to act in response to their surroundings and to have their internal character journey easy to follow. For that reason, he tried to shoot the film linearly as much as possible. That is, trying to minimize shooting the scenes out of order. In that way, the actors were more in sync with the beats of their characters. He also worked to get away with as much on-set practical effects as possible, a move that surprised and delighted Spaney. She had done Pacific Rim Uprising as a young actor and wasn't looking forward to green screens and painted tennis balls. So the emphasis on trying to get as much as they could in the here and now, rather than later inside a computer, was very welcome. This also meant having the iconic villains appear in the flesh to their thrill. Renaud said that it was like coming face to face with a celebrity to encounter the titular alien on set. They all knew, no matter the casting, who the real star of the film was. From its earliest development, Alvarez was determined that the monsters of Alien Romulus stay true to the series' classic lineage, even consulting Ridley Scott and James Cameron for guidance during production. Early on, he'd toyed with radical changes to the creature design and life cycle, but friends persuaded him otherwise, asking, "Why are you trying to fix something that is perfect?" Instead, he chose to add only one thing, to show the way the chestburster evolves into the final xenomorph form. They went back to Alien and Aliens and pulled out unused concept art to see how they might enhance the film while staying true to the iconic monster. Alvarez brought in a former Stan Winston protege in Shane Mahan, who had actually worked on the original Aliens, but now was the co-founder of the aforementioned Legacy Effects. Mahan was eager to return to the series and, quote, poured his guts into it. Legacy Effects built the full-grown xenomorph suits and animatronics, while Mahan brought in his old friend Alec Gillis, who'd worked on Aliens and Alien 3, to craft the chestburster puppets via his own outfit, Studio Gillis. Surprisingly, even legendary effects artist Phil Tippett was involved in the production. He created the stop-motion sequence of a lab rat being crushed and regenerating. In total, Legacy Effects constructed 4 complete xenomorph animatronics for the film, requiring around 80 artists spanning concept design, molding, mechanics, sculpture, and paint. The creature design team's mantra was to honor H.R. Giger's original Big Chap, glossy domed head, skeletal biomechanical body, and silver fangs, while still trying to make this iteration distinct and even more menacing. Alvarez envisioned the xenomorph's exoskeleton be very rough and sharp, like a shark's skin that could cut you if you ran a hand along it. The resulting creature suits are covered in serrated ridges, spikes, and barbs, a fresh detail to make close encounters even more dangerous. At the same time, the new xenomorphs had an almost adolescent quality in their appearance, as Alvarez envisioned them as, quote, newborn teenagers that were still gangly and raw. With improvements in both technology and materials, Mahan's people were able to utilize options that they hadn't had back in the 80s, allowing them to make the suits faster, but still working better than the vintage tech could. The frame would be thinner and lighter, allowing them to put the exoskeletal carapace over the animatronic mechanisms without bulking out the creature. As for the facehuggers, they were built by Weta Workshop in New Zealand, who created them to operate like elaborate puppets, even radio-controlled in some cases, allowing them to spring and writhe believably on camera. David Johnson gleefully recounted how he would play with the remote-controlled facehuggers between takes. All these practical creatures were then seamlessly blended with digital effects by ILM, primarily for movements beyond the puppet or suit's physical capabilities. For instance, in the elevator shaft sequence, the creature you see battling Rain is a mix of techniques, medium shots and close-ups using Legacy's live-action puppet, but when the alien had to crawl swiftly or leap, even in the same shot, ILM's digital model took over. ILM's goal was to ensure audiences could never tell the difference between the practical suit and the digital creature, nicknamed Bigger Chap. The intent was to not go for the hyperactive blur modern action sequences tended towards, but to maintain the alien's menace, slow, deliberate movements, then sudden bursts like many predators are in nature. ILM also enhanced the facehuggers' movements to overcome any shortcomings of the practical animatronics, which had a certain unavoidable stiffness to them at times, giving them quicker and more fluid motion while still feeling realistic. All stages of the monster's life cycle was a threat, even, it turned out, after they were already dead. Alvarez's vision for Alien Romulus required handling complex effects that weren't as simple as just have a computer do it. One of the most challenging sequences for them to try and realize was a high-stakes zero-gravity set piece, where Rain must navigate a corridor in zero-G, while the caustic acid blood from blasted xenomorphs floats all around her. Initially, Alvarez imagined this as a minor beat, but as the concept evolved, he realized it had the potential to be a truly original threat and a scene filled with suspense. Alvarez told his team, "The acid effect needed to have more character. No, the acid is an actor in this scene." He wanted the airborne blobs of alien blood to themselves be menacing, forming an obstacle both beautiful and terrifying. For ILM, that meant simulating globules of acid drifting in zero gravity, reacting to the characters and environment in a believable way. "We were in zero-G," they said. "It needed to look impassable, but the heroes still needed to somehow make it through." They treated the acid almost like a living swarm. The droplets swirl and churn unexpectedly, moved by residual air currents from explosions and the characters' motions. Achieving the right look required extensive R&D and choreography. FX artists went as far as experimenting with fluid dynamics, so that the acid blobs coalesced and broke apart in ways that wouldn't feel like just more CGI magic. They even incorporated a subtle airflow in the scene, a gust from a breached door, to push the acid around, adding to the chaos while grounding the physics. It turned a trip down a hall into a three-dimensional microgravity minefield. It was not only technically complex to animate, but also required carefully coordinated wire work and stunt rigging on set to simulate the actors drifting in zero gravity. The end result was a scene that a lot of people were talking about, even based upon the brief glimpse in the trailer. To facilitate scenes such as these, the production constructed enclosed practical sets rather than relying on digital backdrops. For example, the interior of the group's spaceship was built as a full 360-degree set, and the cockpit was mounted on a gimbal rig, essentially a hydraulically controlled platform, which could jolt and tilt the entire set to realistically simulate spaceflight turbulence. When they pilot their mining hauler with its shuddering floors and rattling equipment, that wasn't just camera shake, it was actually happening. Again, the intent was to make it as easy as possible for the young actors to deliver convincing performances, and techniques like this allow them to focus on being their characters rather than on trying to choreograph physical responses to imaginary stimuli. The filmmaking team also blended cinematographic techniques from the old and the new. Cinematographer Galo Olivares chose lenses that struck a balance between the claustrophobic anamorphic look of the original Alien and the wider spherical look of Cameron's Aliens. He shot Romulus digitally with an ARRI Alexa 35, but used a widescreen 239:1 frame, and even mimicked a stylistic trick, starting scenes with wide-angle lenses and gradually shifting to longer lenses as the tension rises, up to a 75mm for the most intense moments. It's subtle, but it creates a subconscious sensation that the environment is closing around the characters. Alvarez chose to break with tradition on the color palette, though, opting for a stark orange hue as the dominant color in lighting and production design, rather than the cool blues and steel tones used in the previous Alien films, save, of course, for the blue smoky laser effect often associated with the alien's nest. To further ground the visuals, the production employed old-school model making alongside the latest CGI. Miniature spaceship models like the Corbellin 4 and a Weyland-Yutani probe were built by Ian Hunter and Studio Gillis and detailed by hand in the style of 1970s model effects. The models would then be scanned to serve as digital assets when needed, but in many cases were filmed directly. This hybrid choice allowed it to have the same aesthetic as the original, while also giving the option to do things that it would have been difficult or if not impossible to do with a physical model. The film's production designer also aimed to echo the past films, utilizing the station's split aspect between Romulus and Remus. One half was designed to channel the industrial, utilitarian aesthetic of Alien, while the other half evoked the slightly more advanced militaristic tech of Aliens, yet to also feel like its own thing overall. The goal was to embrace the successful first two installments without aping them, to try to recapture some of the magic that made those films cultural phenomena. In summer of 2024, it would be down to critics and audiences to judge how well they succeeded. 20th Century Studios was operating under a very different system from when they were part of 21st Century Fox. And it was quite natural, when your parent company is associated with family-centered entertainment, to worry that the qualities that made films work would be compromised by that association. Their first Predator film, titled Prey, released as a Hulu film, was a hit with critics and audiences, saving the franchise after the prior film, The Predator, a title darkly hilarious given the controversy around the cameo by someone who turned out to be a sex offender, had done poorly with critics and mediocre with audiences. The intersection of two franchises with Deadpool and Wolverine that followed resulted in the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time. The precedent had been set that these properties could thrive under their new corporate umbrella. The question remained whether Alien could also stick the landing. Alien Romulus came out on August 16, 2024. Temporarily dethroning the aforementioned superhero team-up film that had come out July 24th, for a $42 million opening weekend, and consistently outpacing the other holdover summer hits like Twisters and Despicable Me 4, going on to $350.9 million worldwide, second only to Prometheus as far as raw numbers go, and when compared against cost of production, the most return on investment since Aliens. It did well with critics, earning a Rotten Tomatoes score of 80% and a 6.9 at Metacritic, while audiences gave it a cinema score of a B+. Given where Resurrection, the crossovers, and Covenant had left it, the film was an undeniable success, regardless of controversy around Rook and criticism by some that it was derivative and at times strained credulity. One positive comparison was that it felt like it recaptured the atmosphere of the acclaimed Alien Isolation video game with the sense of being hunted by a superior killer. The success of Romulus and of 2025's successful, if polarizing, Alien Earth has ensured Alien a future for now, with a sequel to Romulus ready to begin production and the new Predator film Badlands showing the continued connection with a Weyland-Yutani synthetic as co-star, supporting discussions that 20th Century Studios is planning another attempt at a crossover film and set in the future rather than contemporary. Ridley Scott has even made recent comments that he's considering completing his prequel series. Perhaps what's most surprising of all to come to Alien's future involves the surviving partner of Brandywine, Walter Hill, having penned 50 pages about Ripley that has Sigourney Weaver intrigued enough to suggest she's again open to giving Ripley a final bow for the audience. Comments in October 2025 by Weaver included she was discussing the story with Hill and had spoken with the studio about it, that it would indeed feature the titular alien in it, but be a different kind of alien film. "I love what he's done with the character," Weaver said. "He really gets her strength and her anger and her humor, and it's very hard to write." It's all still up in the air, of course. It could end the same way as Alien 5. But the idea of one last chance, even if only for a proper goodbye this time, that sounds like perfection.
Still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? Perfect organism.
Well, it's strung out shape. But stay frosty and alert. Can't afford to let one of those bastards in here.
This is a maximum security prison. And you have no weapons of any kind.
I'll be honest.
Imminent.
People must realize that the public owns you for life. And when you're dead, you'll all be in commercials dancing with vacuum cleaners. Thank you, Your Honor.